I'm going to start with some written comments, and then I want to move into the background, into my own life, and try to tell you something about the way it's gone, which is continually surprising me as I go back and make connections about these things in retrospect. Here we go. The title of this is, "But Who is That Other One Who Walks There Beside You?" which is a paraphrase of a line from Eliot's four quartets from the Little Gidding, where the speaker sees or hears or thinks that there's another person besides the one that he knows is there next to him. There's a moment in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Did I say Little Gidding? Sorry, excuse me. Wasteland, the fifth part of Wasteland, that has stayed with me for over 50 years now. A dreamlike moment in a dreamlike poem where what is real and what is hallucinatory or a mere fiction of the imagination crosses and recrosses the mind's eye like something caught out of the corner of one's sight of vision. The passage occurs in the last section of the poem, the part Eliot composed while he was recovering from a nervous breakdown in an asylum in Geneva, Switzerland, in the winter of 1921 and 22. Images of a father recently dead. Those are pearls that were his eyes. His marriage to the vivacious, unstable Vivian on the rocks. The search for answers that would hold up against the splintered fragments of contemporary civilization. All of these the poem records, but there is something more. Water for the thirsty seeker that he wants. If there were water, T.S. Eliot's indeterminate ghost self-size. If there were water and no rock. If there were rock and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip drop, drip drop, 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 drop. But where he finds himself now, in the arid wasteland of the South, there is no water. A desert, and a cold one at that. And the mind moving between two worlds, not unlike Dante's wasteland, begins to hallucinate. The passage Eliot the Pilgrim tells us in one of his famous footnotes. We're stimulated by the account of one of the Antarctic expeditions. I forget which, but I think one of Shackleton's. It was related that the party of explorers, at the extremity of their strength, had the constant illusion that there was one more member than could actually be counted. The source is indeed Shackleton, whose memoirs of the polar expedition at the height of World War I recounts one grueling march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, when it seemed to him that we were 4, not 3. Here is how Eliot reconfigures that scene in the final section of his poem, cutting the number of travelers from 3 to 2, expanded inexplicably by the hooded stranger by their side in the harrowing moment. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? For anyone who has read Luke's Gospel, we know what this passage echoes, as it undoubtedly is meant to do. The scene takes place on that first Easter Sunday, you will recall, when two of Christ's downtrodden disciples are on the road to a village about 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about everything that had happened, Luke tells us, meaning the surprise capture of Jesus in the garden, followed by his rushed trial and execution by crucifixion outside the city walls. And so the Jewish and the Roman authorities had done away with this troublesome, charismatic figure, and his disciples had scattered like shot dogs in a field. Suddenly, while they are discussing these catastrophic events, Jesus is suddenly walking there next to them. 3, where a moment before there seemed to be only 2. Though, as Luke tells us, they were kept from recognizing him. And then the figure asks them what it is that they are discussing. They stood still, Luke tells us, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem that does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asks. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. And the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, 'How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?' And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going to go on. But they urged him strongly, 'Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, and the day is almost over.' And so he went in to stay with them. And when he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?' They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. And there they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, 'It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon.' And then the 2 told what had happened on the way and how they recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. In the breaking of the bread. Luke's passage always stirs me because it contains an outline, the essentials of the Mass. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Luke writes, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So there you have the first part of the Mass, readings from the Old and the New Testament and the Psalms, then followed by the breaking of the bread, Christ's own body, to be shared by the entire faith community. For me, as for others, from Robert Southall and Hopkins to Chesterton and David Jones to Eliot himself and Robert Lowell and John Berryman and Denise Levertov and Ron Hansen and Franz Wright and Mary Carr and so many other writers and artists, to say nothing of the countless millions of believers down the ages. This has been at the center of what we believe and why we act and write as we do. Still, that is the core, the central brotherhood and the sisterhood, if you will, the lens of companionship, the compan, a word that at its root means those we would share our bread with, leavened or unleavened, which includes, finally, whoever approaches the table. Two things there are that I can point to over a lifetime of teaching and writing. Two intertwined activities, really. The Word and that to which the Word points. The deeper reality, as Hopkins has said, within the appearances of things, the very inscape of the thing. Call it the sacramental aspect of things, the sense that the mystery hovers over everything, illumines things, shines through them. Even more, that Christ plays, as Hopkins says, in 10,000 faces not his. 100 blessings a day to count, Jewish tradition has it. Points of light, grace notes, illuminations, call them what you will. There are many poets, but few who can help me enter the special landscape of which I speak. Of course, there are splinters of light in nearly every poet of note, reflecting the beauty of images or the transcendent beauty of music in their words, who hint at something deeper. Poetry that can actually raise the hair on the back of my neck, as Houseman said it should. Like Scripture often, like the unfolding of the Mass, like anything sacred, poetry is often overlooked, underrated, or even dismissed as of little or no consequence. This has to do, I think, with the relative speed at which things draw our attention. The brain, multitasking any number of things, channel surfing, listening in to several conversations because absorbed by none. I want to talk now, without the written page before me, about my own background and about things that I think have shaped me as I look back on that. I come out of a mixed marriage, that is in the sense that my dad was a Roman Catholic, full Italian. My mom was sometime Lutheran, sometime Baptist, etc. But she didn't attend any of the services, but I know that she had come out of that tradition, Swedish Lutheranism as well. We grew up in New York City, on the main streets of the city, tenements that no longer, they were ripped down back in the 1950s. There were no elevators. We lived on the top floor. In one tenement, there was only one bathroom for 4 families. The other one, at least, had a small toilet in the back, but we took our baths in the kitchen sink, pretty much. That's where we lived in the 1940s when my father was in the Army during World War II. It was a rough neighborhood. We were the only Italians on the block. It was mostly German-Irish. I learned how to escape the gangs on the street by learning how to jump from roof to roof, which sometimes was like 10 feet. And what you couldn't miss, obviously, because that is That's five stories down. But Johnny Coyne, who lived up the block, who was an altar boy at St. Patrick's, taught me how you leap and then you jump onto the tar roof next door. And usually the gang won't follow you, he said. They still got me. They still got me. It was a rough time. I remember making my first communion in St. John's, with a little black suit with the knickers that they used to wear in those days. My mother was so proud that she took us to a professional photographer to have the picture taken. I'm the oldest of seven children. My father was a mechanic. It's what kept them alive, I think, during the war, because they needed someone who could do induction fuel systems, and he knew carburetors, if he knew anything. He had learned carburetors, and so when the train was pulling out, along with a lot of other Italian Americans out of New York, a Jeep stopped and pulled my father off the train because they needed someone down at Aberdeen Proving Grounds to train others in carburetors. That's the only thing that most of those guys who were from the neighborhood died at the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, so that's just one of the realities. I would go to Mass with my father. I remember one time, I must have been 5 years old, at a Precious Blood, an Italian church over on the east side in the 60s. And I remember the priest calling Paul Mariani, saying, "Paul, come up." That's my father's name. "Come up to the front and help with the collection." And I thought he meant me, and I was 5 years old. I remember following my dad up, and suddenly one of the neighbors picked me right up off the ground and just put me in one of the pews, to keep me quiet and until the work could be done. After the war, as soon as a couple of years after the war, my father finally was able to use the GI Bill to move to the paradise of Long Island called Levittown. And I can still remember, this is a true story, I was just about 8 years old. My brother Walter was 2 years younger. We had these rusty old fishing rods, and I remember in Levittown there was no grass or anything yet because they had just built all these thousands of homes that looked the same. And the bulldozers had cut out a hole in the ground, in the mud, and there was water in it from the rain, and we went fishing there, my brother and I, and one of the farm boys came over and he said, "You catch anything?" So that was our induction into the country life of Levittown. I never attended Catholic grade schools. My brothers and sisters all did. I went to the public schools, but then we moved. For high school, my mother wanted me to go, she said I was a bright little boy, so she wanted me to go to Chaminade High School, a Catholic school run by the Marianists in Mineola. So my dad had a gas station by this point out in Mineola, and we moved the family out there, and I attended Chaminade until at the end of my junior year, a young priest said to me, "I'd like to talk to you, Paul." He said, I was 16, and he said, "I think you may have a vocation." And I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "How would you like to go to Beacon, New York," which was the kind of proto-seminary, if you will, for the prep school, preparing you for the Marianists, a teaching order, mostly brothers with some priests. And so I did. I joined up. My father drove us up. My father and mother drove us up. My mother was crying up to Beacon, New York, right on the Hudson River. And I spent a year there, a full year. It was a beautiful year. It was a great year. I learned how to study. That's what I learned how to do. It was, we all lived in one room, all the guys, with our beds, like in the army, in the barracks. We had these large not a trowel, I guess, but large sinks, that we could wash in. The water was usually cold. We could see Mount Beacon out the window there. That was beautiful to be able to see that. We took Latin, and we took some Greek, and we took mathematics and English, and it was just, I wrote my first poetry there. I remember there was there was a contest. The nuns up on the other end of Beacon were offering $10, first prize, for a poem, a religious poem written during Lent. So I went to Brother Clyde, and I said, Brother Clyde, how do you write a poem? And he said, I don't know. He said, but here's a book. It's an anthology. Read these poems in the anthology, and you'll learn how to write a poem. And then he said, and look for the meter. You got and rhyme. So I said, okay. So da-dum, 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 da-dum. Okay, I got that line down. And then I just repeated that line 14 times and wrote a sonnet. And it was a poem about the Passion. It was about the Passion of Christ. And then I submitted it. And won. I won the $10. So I bought a rosary for my Lutheran mother, which she accepted quite gracefully. And so that was the start. That poem. I have it somewhere. I don't look for it too much, but I know it's out there somewhere. After a year, one image I want to tell you about, which really moved me. This is the image. There's a little German priest, and he had a very hard time. He had a very strong accent. But I would watch him as an altar boy in the little chapel where we had our Mass. And when he would say Mass, he would tremble. He would tremble. He was that moved by what was happening. And I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten that image of him. And this was at the same time, by the way, as the Hungarian Revolution. So from Life magazine, we had these pictures that were going up on the bulletin board in the study hall of NKVD, soldiers who had been captured by the Hungarians in Budapest. And they had shot them. And they were using quicklime on their bodies in order to, decompose them more quickly. So and then also we watched television. I still remember Castro. He was still in the mountains at that point, black and white television about this big, about 60 of us around the TV that size. And I'm saying, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? And brother says, I don't know, And shortly after that, of course, that Castro took over the police stations and then took over Cuba. But those are some of the images that I got in my poetry that come from that year, and over against the quiet and the solitude of being in Beacon, praying daily, studying, and following that pathway. Then what happened is I came home in July, and I decided not to go back. I discovered girls, is what happened, and and it was good for me. But I did promise. I remember I had this vision. I'm not kidding. Vision. Let's call it. I remember I was the goalie for the soccer team, and I remember all the action was happening down at the other end of the field, and I remember while the action was happening down at that end, I had a vision of this young cheerleader, and she was doing a little dance for me. So I said, okay, I'll tell you what. I said, Lord, if I don't become a priest, I will devote myself, I will dedicate my life in the same way that a priest would, to teaching. Honestly, I said that, and I've really tried to keep that promise ever since that time, to see it is a vocation, and to work at it as hard as you can, okay? And, hopefully even die with my boots on, who knows, but that's what I want to do. That's what I've done I've never turned back from that. And that, I can still remember the day when I promised that, although it came in a strange vision of a cheerleader. God works in strange ways. what happened was it was too late to go into college, so I spent the 5th year of high school, not at Chaminade because they said I had graduated, but it was too late to go to college. So I went to the high school across the street, Mineola, took a lot of courses in calculus because my dad, being a practical man, wanted me to go on to become an engineer. And if not an engineer, then a lawyer, and if not a lawyer, then a doctor, if not, in other words, something where there would be money. You know what I mean? You can understand, coming from a working class background, that made sense. If I had ever said to him, Dad, you know what? Oh, I got to tell you one other story. This really happened. About a year later, I was working with him in the summer at Bauman's Day Camp, and my job was to take care of all the garbage for the entire camp, okay? And I remember he pulled the truck off the road, the dump truck, and he turned the key off, and this is about 7 in the morning, and he said to me, is it true that you're writing poems? Are you writing poems? I said, yeah, a couple, So he said, he thought about it for a minute. You mean you might want to be a poet or something like that? I don't know, Dad. I just want to, write some poems. And then he said, it's okay. You're still my son. You're still my son. Started up the truck, and we were off. So there was already I'll tell you something here about language. Think about it. You're working in my dad went bankrupt running the gas station. Every time he tried to make money, they would raise, the guys in the 3-piece suits would come in and they would raise the rent, okay? So finally he just couldn't do it, and, he had to close the shop down and work for somebody else. That's what happened. So I said to myself, how do I get out of this? How do I get out of it? What do I do? God bless my mother. When I was in Chaminade at the high school, the Catholic high school, I couldn't play sports because I had to work in the gas station every day. I had to change oil, change spark plugs, sweep the place up, serve gas, which is 25 cents a gallon then, by the way, okay? And, fix flat tires, things like that, He said to my mother, he said, I think I'm going to take Paulie out of high school to work full time with me because I need him, And my mother said, I'll kill you, in so many words, Over my dead body, you're going to take Paul out of school. You're not going to do it. It was just a different vision, if you will. I know later my dad's greatest dream was to run a diner somewhere up in the Delaware Water Gap. That was. But I said, Dad, I got different plans, So anyway, they had both gone only to the 9th grade. So this was new. You know what I mean? This was a new thing for us in the family to go all the way through high school. Not only that, but a good Catholic school that prepared you for college, But that's what she was going to, that's what she wanted. That was her dream. That was her dream. She had lost her own father when she was 9 years old. She had been the valedictorian of her class, but she had to quit to go to work at the age of 15, okay, that kind of thing. So anyway, this is all part of it. The thing that's sustaining me all the way through this, by the way, let me reinforce, is my faith, is simply that one that's always there, that I can talk to. I can just say, okay, Lord, how do I, can you help me in this one? And all my life I've always felt like, He'll take care of it. Don't be anxious. Don't be afraid. It'll work out. And it's happened over and over and over and over and over, now for nearly 70 years, So that's just the reality of it, or at least that's the way I perceive the reality of it. Went on to Manhattan, thought I'd go to engineering, but once I heard the brothers talking about the arts, I said, holy smoke. You mean you actually teach courses where I can read the classics, and I can actually do Homer and Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides? I can read those things? And whoa! I mean, it really just it was like I was floating. I was floating. I just couldn't believe that I was going to have the chance to do that. And that, I mean, you know, I had a car, and my buddy John Monahan had a car, and the idea was we would trade. You know, he would drive one day from Mineola into the city, which was like 30 miles each way to New York, okay? And then my car blew up after 1 week. And for the next 4 years, John graciously picked me up every single day and took me. You know, it took me up to Manhattan College. I'll never forget. He's the only guy that I've kept a close contact. He's the godfather of one of my sons. I mean, it's that kind of a relationship, John. Yeah. The 4 years at Manhattan, when I did the great books, essentially, it was the great books courses. You started with the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, and you moved up to the 20th century by the time you were a senior. We had to take 150 credits instead of 120. The reason for that is, if you wanted to go to graduate school, there was still a kind of, if I may say this, a kind of anti-Catholic bias. So they didn't want you to have theology, you know, as part of that. So what the brothers did is, we'll give you 30 credits of theology that you'll have to take beyond the normal 120 credits. Do you see what I mean? So if they say how many credits, you know, and it did happen, in fact. When I went to Colgate, I remember I went there hoping to get some kind of a partial scholarship, so that because I didn't have any money, I just couldn't do it. So I remember sitting in the inn in Hamilton, New York, and I remember this gentleman, this German professor, saying, "I see you went." He said to me, "I see you went to a Catholic school, you know," and yeah, I did, yeah. And so you took a lot of philosophy, huh? So I said, yeah, took a lot of philosophy. He said, like what? He said, did you take the Scholastics? Did you take Aquinas? I said, I did. I did take Aquinas. I took Scotus. I said, I took Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and you know, and rang off about 20 names of philosophers. And they said, oh, okay. But it was still, there was still, you know, there was, back in the 60s, there was still something of that. It was not so subtle that I didn't catch it. Do you know what I mean? But I did get the job. The faith is the thing that sustained me again. You know, getting to Mass. It was a rough area. We were up in the snow country up there in upstate New York. I remember seeing the priest, a man in his 40s at the time. He said he was actually absolutely white. I mean, he looked like he had just lost everything. And I said, Father, what's the matter? And it was February, I remember. And he said, this is a bad month in Colgate, you know, up here in Hamilton, New York. He said, because the winters are so long that in February, that's when the suicides begin. And he said, I've just come back from giving the last rites to a farmer only a mile from here who just blew his head off. And I didn't even know how to anoint him, he said. There was nothing on his head to anoint. I mean, that never, you know, that stayed with me, that image. This is just one image of what, you know, of what was happening there. I married a wonderful woman, Catholic, Irish, Italian, and she has sustained me over the years. I mean, I told her one time, about 20 years ago, I said, you know, you asked me what the closest moment of Christ is in my life. You know, it's something that you ask in the Cursillo, and I said, you are. I said, you are. I don't know what I'd do without you, you know? Honest to God, I don't know what I would do without you. It's as simple as that. And that's true. I still believe that. I believe it more strongly, in fact, than ever. So I don't know how I got her. I mean, I didn't deserve her, but I'm telling you, it made all the difference in the world to have the right woman as a partner with you all those years. We have 3 sons, 3 boys, Paul, Mark, and John. Okay, good biblical names, okay? Even their middle names are like Paul, Philip, and Mark, Thomas, and John Matthew. So even there, we doubled it. You see what I mean? Paul, the oldest, is a Jesuit priest. He's in the California province. His name is Paul Mariani. He's at Santa Clara. He's teaching there, a tenure track job. First year teaching full time. He teaches Chinese history and Asian history. He's a specialist in China. He speaks fluent Mandarin, some Cantonese. He speaks fluent fluent Taiwanese because he spent a couple of years there, and he just loves it. He just loves it. He's glowing when I spoke to him about what's it like teaching there. He's doing well. That's good. And then the other two boys are married. Mark is married to Karen. They have two boys, Gavin and Griffin, and then John, the youngest, is married to Maria, and they have Juliana, Sophia, and little Anthony. Remember that song, Little Anthony, right? Yeah. So, and they're just, I love them. I'm what they call their play slave. When I'm with them, they just want Grandpa. One time my wife went down without me because I was teaching, and Juliana said, Grandma, we like to see you, but next time bring Grandpa because he makes it a party. Okay? So I'm delighted. I'm really delighted with that. So, went on to teach. My first love was Hopkins. See, I don't want to go over time here. Yeah, 5 more minutes and then I want to shift, okay? I just want to talk a little bit here about Hopkins. I was a senior in Manhattan College, and I'm oh, by the way, each night we have to drive home, then I have to work at the A&P from 6 until 11 at night, stocking shelves, and then have to study until about 2 in the morning, and then get up at, 6 and, go. And when you're young, you can do that kind of thing for a while, I don't know if, I know I couldn't do it now. When I was a senior, we had each student had to, it was all men's school, and later it became civilized and it had women, but at the time it was just men. And we for our senior year, we had to take, we were assigned a poet that we had to study up on, and then we had to deliver a half-an-hour talk on in the class. It was a good idea. So I was given Yeats. Now that's not bad, right? But my friend James Blake, nice name, huh? James Blake said, look, he even changed his name to Seamus later, just to give you an idea of how much he wanted to do Yeats, okay? And he said, Mariani, he was my fraternity brother. And he said, I'll tell you what, he said, I'll buy you a beer down at the Greenleaf if we can switch. Because I've got someone named Hopkins, okay, Gerard Manley Hopkins. So I wanted to do Hopkins. I loved Hopkins anyway, so I wanted to do Hopkins anyway. So I said, make it 2 beers and it's a deal. So sure enough, I got 2 beers at the Greenleaf. He got Yeats, and he's gone on the radio to talk about Yeats after, so these things have an effect. And I went on to talk about the wreck of the Deutschland, and I was absolutely overwhelmed. Here's the reason. You think about it. For a young Catholic, where is the Catholic tradition, in the English language? I mean, if it were French or Spanish or Italian, you could find it. But I said, where? I mean, I'm studying. Okay, there's T.S. Eliot in the Church of England tradition, Ezra Pound, Yeats, etc. But where is the Catholic intellectual voice? Where's the Catholic poetic voice? And then I discover Hopkins, and I can't believe it. Excuse me. I can't believe it. I'm absolutely floored. I'm in love with the guy. I really am. And I start studying him, and not only that, but he becomes a model for me, because I say, because there's a kind of fancy way that you're not quite as good as the others, as a young Catholic. If you were really smart, you could be a fallen away Catholic, you know what I mean? Or you could be a recovering Catholic or something like that. But to actually be a practicing Catholic, what's the matter with you? Well, that's anyway what happened to me. And I said, no, but this is the guy that's going to show me how to do it. Hopkins is going to show me. I'm going to study him, and he's going to show me that it's possible to do it. Well, that's been the case. First of all, by reading about him, and then after a while studying, going on for the PhD, the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Then in my 30s, finally starting to write poetry. And, going back to Hopkins and then others who influenced me. William Carlos Williams in The American Grain, writing, because I'm also an American poet. So I wanted to write in that tradition. How do you write with the American idiom? How do you actually get New Jersey talk, for example? How do you get New Jersey talk into a poem, you know? I mean, Frost did a great job with North of Boston, you know, and the New England accent. But how do you get, say, where I'm from, you know, New Jersey and New York? Williams showed me the way. How do you change the patterns? John Berryman showed me the way. How do you approach someone like Robert Lowell, who's from the Boston Brahmin families, you know, down here on Commonwealth and near Beacon Hill? How do you get him in? And because he had been a convert in the 40s, what fascinated me about him is he had come from from an Episcopalian family, and partly in rebellion, and partly because he had been reading Jacques Maritain, and he had been reading Dawson, Christopher Dawson, and he'd been reading Hopkins, okay, and Dante. Okay, he had studied Dante with Alan Tate, for example, and Robert Penn Warren. Okay, so he became a Catholic, and he wrote some extraordinary poetry, like the Quaker Graveyard on Nantucket. Now later, he said the burden was too heavy on him, and he suffered from manic depression. Okay, but the early Lowell is the one that really moved me for years. John Berryman, who returned after he had left the church after the suicide or the death of his father. Probably his mother killed him rather than suicide, but it was called as suicide. And he didn't trust, you know, he said, how could God let this happen? But as he got older, he came back to the church and wrote some of the most extraordinary religious poetry of the from a Catholic perspective in the 20th century. Denise Levertov, Mary Carr, Franz Wright, Thomas Merton. Then in prose, Flannery O'Connor, who I just adore. You know, I almost did a biography. It's just that I've only got so many years, you know, to do it. But I mean, I love Flannery O'Connor. I've been visited that bit, knelt in that church and prayed in the same pews that she prayed in. These are the people that sustain me. Okay, so now it's already 10 to 8. So what I'm going to do is I want to read a few of my poems, just talk a little bit about them, so you can get a sense of what it is that I've done in the poetic vein. Okay, so. I think I'll read a poem that's not necessarily religious, but I just love this poem, and it's about my granddaughter. And I'd like to read this one, okay? It's called High Tea with Miss Juliana. And it's sort of like in the English tradition of having high tea in the afternoon. She's 2.5 years old, she, you know how little girls like to do imaginary tea, you know? They pour it out, you know, and then they stir it for you, and then they say, do you like it? Would you like another cup? And would you like another cup? You know, et cetera, that kind of thing. And I just loved it. It was just absolutely fascinating. And it has a headnote that says, begin at the beginning, the king said gravely, and go on till you come to the end, and then stop. That's how you write a short story, or you write a poem or anything, okay? But also it's what happens with our lives. We go on with it, and then it comes to an end. And it's in couplets. In the land of the Jub, together they had tea. High tea, one has to understand. 6 cups of imaginary tea. The good Miss Juliana Francis, age 2.5, and her grandfather, 64. How do you do this afternoon, Miss Juliana, he began. Excuse me, I'm going to need a little water up here. I had a 2-hour seminar just before I came over here, so. How do you do this afternoon, Miss Juliana, he began. Good manners there in Jub land, being understood in de rigueur between the professor and his finical little queen. Sporting diapers beneath her summer dress, she poured her airy tea in cups with such finesse they might have been in Queen Victoria's drawing room instead of in his modest parlor. Might I presume upon you, my lady dear, for yet another piece of cake? Oh, sure, she too demurely said. But let me bake it first. It will only take 1 minute, i.e., 1 minute in her understanding, for they had time within it for another cup, or 2, or 4, or 6, or 3 of Miss Juliana's very best imaginary tea, and time for her to sit upon his lap so he might read her all about the midnight land of Jub-Jub, and then confer together about the best way to pick the naughty dirts from between their toes, or which of her many skirts her dolly, coincidentally named for Daddy John, should wear, and which chair he should sit upon if Daddy John were to be invited to partake of tea with them, together with a second piece of cake, which was humming along just fine in the imaginary oven in the slowly darkening room. High tea on a Sunday afternoon at summer's end. Sweet credences of summer. How better to spend an hour, a day, a year. And Alice leading down the rabbit hole, and him following into Jub-Jub town, and all cares left behind now, as the little girl, who would not be little long, beckoned toward the still enchanted wood. That's one. I wanted to read that so that you don't think that I'm really overly morose in terms of the other poems. When I was going for my PhD, I needed to make a living, obviously, and so I held 3 jobs. One of the jobs was teaching uptown at Hunter Uptown, which is Lehman College now. And then I'd take the subway downtown and teach at 23rd Street, which was the police academy, which would later be John Jay College, okay, but it was then at 23rd Street. My most famous student that I had then was Frank Serpico. Do you remember him? Serpico was my student. We used to double date. Yeah, he was a good guy. He was a really good guy. I liked him a lot. But it was just at the time of the Knapp Commission, just before that was to explode, 67, 68. And he said to me one day, he said, "Hey, Paul, do you know who I am?" I said, "Yeah, you're Frank Serpico. You're in my class. You're in humanities. I teach you Goethe and Milton and all the other biggies." He said, "Do you know anything else about me?" I said, No, I know you're dating this nurse, etc." He said, "Okay, that's good. That's enough." I remember one night we were, let's see. I'm just wondering, I want to tell you this story. Let's see here, one second. I got it. Thanks very much. Thank you so much. I've got the poem. I'm going to read it to you. This is a poem. Now here I am, I'm teaching humanities to the police officers. So they're going for a 4-year degree in criminal justice. This was a new experiment then, in the early 60s. It was a great experiment, and I'm so delighted that I did it. In fact, when I left to come to UMass, to New England, they gave me a gold badge with the number 211 on it. That was the course I taught. I taught English 211. And they gave me a badge. And they said, "Look, you ever get stopped, you just flash this, and that'll get you all taken care of," they said, okay? Well, as it turned out, I never got stopped in New York. So I did get stopped, though, by the university police up at UMass. So I took out the badge and I said, "Look at this." And he said, "What the hell is that?" He said, "Put that thing away." So that was it. It didn't do much any good. But anyway, here's the thing. When you taught at the police academy, you taught the same course twice a day because of shifts. So if you taught it, say, at 11 o'clock, then you'd have to teach it 8 hours later, at 6 or 7, whatever, see? And that was fine. It was the same course, but, you know, at different times. So one night, you know, you get finished at about, say, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, okay, by the time you were finished teaching. And then the cops, if they liked you, they'd invite you down to Rooney's, which was a pub down on the corner, and they invited me. They used to call me Doc. I was 26 years old, okay? So they took me to, we would go down there, and we'd have Boilermakers, okay? They would teach me how to drink Boilermakers. Whiskey shots, and then some beer chases. It was a real education. They taught me as much as I taught them, you know? Well, one night, I said, Frank, come on with us, you know. So we were all getting on an elevator, and I was on the elevator. Frank is looking into the elevator, and there are about 12 police officers on the, and he looks at him and he says, I'll walk, okay. Just, you know, because he was the rat. You see what I mean? Even though as far as I was concerned, he was a pretty straight guy. There was a lot of corruption. So we go down to the Rooney's, and he said, I'll join you, and he does come in. And this is the story of what happened. It's called The Republic. I happened to be teaching Plato's Republic. That's what I was teaching the police officers. Okay, great. So here it is. Midnight. For the past 3 hours, I've raked over Plato's Republic with my students, all of them John J. Cops. And now some of us have come to Rooney's to unwind. Boilermakers, double shots and triples. Fitzgerald's still in his undercover clothes and giveaway white socks. And 2 lieutenants, Saluzzi in the sharkskin suit and D'Ambruzzo in the leather, have just invited me to catch their fancy and illegal digs somewhere up in Harlem when this cop begins to tell his story. How he and his partner trailed this pusher for 6 weeks before they trapped him in a burnt-out tenement somewhere down in Soho. One coming at him up the stairwell, the other up the fire escape and through a busted window. But by the time they've grabbed him, he's standing over an open window and he's clean. The partner races down into the courtyard and begins going through the garbage until he finds what it is he's after. A white bag hanging from a junk mimosa, like the Christmas gift it is, and which now he plants back on the subject. Cross-examined by a lawyer who does his best to rattle them, he and his partner stick by their story, and the charges stick. Fitzgerald shrugs. Business as usual. But the cop goes on. Better to let the guy go free than under oath to have to lie like that. And suddenly, you can hear the heavy suck of air before Saluzzi, who half an hour before was boasting about being on the take, staggers to his feet, outraged at what he's heard, and insists on taking the bastard downtown so they can book him. Which naturally brings to an end the discussion we've been having. And soon, each of us is heading for an exit, embarrassed by the awkward light the cop has thrown on things. Which makes it clearer now to me why the state would offer someone like Socrates a shot of hemlock, and even clearer why Socrates would want to drink it. By the way, 30 years later, I heard that Frank Serpico was going to be up in Greenfield, Massachusetts, okay? So my wife and I went to hear him. And he was great. He was talking about getting out of Iraq. That's what he was talking about at that point, okay? And he and his nephew, who's also his agent, were there, okay, along with other speakers. So after he spoke, what I did is I went over to the side and I said, Frank, I want to give you this book. I was your teacher. He says to me, oh yeah? What grade? Third? That was... I said, no, Frank, this is the John Jay College, okay? So he said, oh, okay. So I give him the book with a poem in it, and I'm talking to his agent nephew. And then about 2 minutes later, he says, hey, this poem is about me, you know. He says, give me a hug. So I gave him a hug, and I said, I got to go, Frank, but it's good to see you again, Frank, after all these years, you know. So there was a kind of closure, you know, to that. Okay. All right. A couple more poems, and then I think we're going to open it up to question and answer, okay? Let's see. I think I'll read this one, Eurydice. Here's a story about being a young teacher. At the same time, I'm up at the Hunter. Same time, within a year of my teaching Frank Serpico, and I was teaching a lot of secretaries and workers, you know, 9-to-5 jobs and that kind of thing. It's called Eurydice. So the myth of Eurydice is behind it. Okay. A Winter's Tale. I was teaching up at Hunter, a night class. 1966 or 7, mostly stenographers and clerks with 9-to-5 jobs somewhere in Manhattan or the boroughs. Introduction to poetry and prose, the 101 variety. That evening, it was Thomas Hardy. Hap, The Darkling Thrush, The Convergence of the Twain, The Appointed Iceberg peeling the skin off the Titanic like some sardine can. Bleak and heady stuff for a bleak and heady time. Nam, napalm, race riots, Agent Orange, the whole shebang. And I was on that night, my best imitation Orphic voice, rhapsodizing on blind necessity and fate, the marriage of a massive ship, state-of-the-art, with some far more massive iceberg. Hardy's hope seemed a hollow thing in the face of so much suffering, as I suppose he wanted it to pale for the poem he was writing. No one to blame, no grand design, no god or gods, no anything but a rolling of blind dice. I preened myself. After all, I was 26 and understood the mossy myths, dark and cold, that have told us since before the Greeks how the world really works. And then the time was up, and the students gathered up their things and headed out. I was packing my books and the papers I would have to grade back in our small apartment out in Flushing, where I lived with my wife and 2 small sons, trying to finish my degree against the odds. It was late, past 10, and the wind blowing down the cold corridors of New York. I meant to head straight for the subway round the corner to begin the long ride home on the RRT, which along with other huddled masses would take me there. I looked up to see a woman standing by my desk, neither young nor old, one of my students, as nameless as the rest. She seemed shaken and her face was pale. "You're a good man," she was saying. "Tell me, you don't believe the things you said tonight. Tell me, you believe there is a God. Understand, this was outré and unprofessional on her part, almost comic, except she looked as if I'd robbed her. And for what it matters, I did subscribe to something like a creed, or thought I did. But we were talking poetry here, and this was New York City, not some Porongville." I assured her my own beliefs had nothing to do with it. These were Hardy's gifts to us, the poems written out of a world he had suffered. True, he wasn't everyone's cup of tea, a brilliant use of language, I warm myself by thinking. And the skeptic's view was something she might sip on, a way of adding to the available stock of reality we are heir to. I turned towards the elevator and bowed goodnight, then walked quickly down the long, cold corridors and past the guard out onto Lexington, then down into the subway, repeating Hardy's lines about how the imminent will that stirs and urges everything prepared a sinister mate for her. The place was almost empty at that hour, and I already at the turnstile when I saw her following at a distance, her lips moving with the cold. I'm hard of hearing, and the train was already entering the station, so I tried to read her lips. "Please," her eyes were saying above the racket of the place. "You're a good man. Tell me you believe." Eurydice, I thought, drowning in the hell of her own making, pallid and accusing, and I some unwitting Orpheus. For Christ's sake, this to myself and then to her, I do believe, okay? I do, even if just then I felt nothing but annoyance. And to tell the truth, a touch of icy terror. "Please, go home, it's late. Everything's okay." A gesture only, comforting someone who needed to be comforted. She smiled weakly, a nervous smile, as if she just avoided a collision with something looming out there, immense and cold, and backed upstairs to greet the vast and open void as the doors closed after me. What in hell had I just done? I thought, hanging from a strap, the weary, deadened faces all about me. What was this? Some operatic scene by Gluck? How badly had I just compromised myself, I wondered. Then turned to catch two amber lights and a skull dangling from a strap across the aisle as the train went hurling down the sullen rails, lugging each of us, as it happens, to our final destination. One more, folks, and then I'll turn it over. I want to end with a poem to my son, the Jesuit. It's called "The Cup." It's got a great drawing or etching by Barry Moser, a dear friend of mine. This is the actual cup that we gave him for his ordination, which now is in the a little chest in our living room. This chalice, made of burnished gold, when not in use, rests in the place of honor high on our old oak cupboard in our dining room here in Montague. A modest thing, the cup, with a small cross on the base in Chinese red, in the center of which there rests an even more modest diamond, which once adorned the engagement ring I placed on my wife's fourth finger 40 years ago, there among the unicorns sequestered in the cloisters, who to this day look out over the fabled Hudson toward New Jersey. This was the same ring her girlfriends used to say was oh so cute and so adorable, and which seemed to wince under a Long Island canapé light. And to tell the truth, I'd be the first to go along with them, though the ring cost me 12 back-breaking weeks hauling bales of hay and rank manure down at Bauman's Day Camp in Merrick the summer after college, armed with a degree in English and, except for her, zero prospects for the future. A week before I left home to begin teaching in the inhospitable Chenango Valley, we drove down to Canal Street to a jeweler her father knew, where we found the biggest diamond $240 could buy. Understand, I did what I could, and she, for her part, always made it seem as if it were enough. Love, filling the gap 12 20s could not supply. And here's the thing. Over the years, as I learned to make a living, and that a good one, I used to joke about the ring, though it strikes me as I tell this, she never did. A year after I bought it, we got married, exchanging vows I surely tested with the years. In time, we watched our 3 sons elbow their way into the world and saw our eldest enter Loyola's company to become at last a priest. And as the time for ordination loomed, and the awful scandals broke his heart and ours. She took the little ring she had for so long treasured to a jeweler's down in Brooklyn, and had the baby diamond soldered to the cross there on the cup, a sign of something good that held against the years. Where now, when the late summer sun spreads like blood-red wine across the dining room, it makes the little diamond shine until it says straight out whatever diamonds say in that language only light and diamonds know.